But we're going to get into the Longview Race Riot of 1919. All right. I'm going to get into that real quick here. I'm going to pull this up. So the Longview Race Riot of 1919. All right. Longview Race Riot occurred on July 10 to July 12 in the northeast Texas city, where 1,790 blacks comprised 31% of the town's 5,700 people in 1919. Racial tensions were high across the United States due to the race riots that began in March 1919. Just before the Longview riot, local teacher and newspaper correspondent Samuel L. Jones and Dr. Calvin P. Davis, prominent leaders of the Black community, have begun encouraging local Black farmers to avoid selling to local white cotton brokers and to instead sell directly to buyers in Galveston. All right. Also, local Blacks set up a cooperative store where they competed with and angered local white merchants. That's key before I go on with that. With the blacks back then, they understood they were in a competition and they were willing to be in a competition, and they cooperated with each other to make sure, certain things happen for them. So I'm going to read that again. Also, local blacks set up a cooperative store where they competed. They didn't have no problem competing with the other white merchants. So where they competed with and angered local white merchants. These incidents raised tensions in Longview long before the riot occurred. So, there was already tensions because there was some jealousy apparently between with the white merchants, and they were jealous about the black merchants or the black store owners or, the black folks working in their businesses. In early June, a local black man, Lemuel Walters, was beaten by two white men for allegedly making romantic advances towards their sister, a white woman from Kilgore. Walters was arrested. And we heard something like this before. I read this, not this particular thing, but you heard me read about Ed Johnson and how he was accused of making passes or something like that to a white woman in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So here we are in Texas with the same, always seems like that's always the same MO or the accusations that they come up with, or they came up with back in those days in the early 1900s and sometimes 1800s and the 1700s. There's always an alleged accusation of a black man doing some type of sexual or romantic advances towards a white female. That always seems to be the MO for some reason back then. Like I said, it's not the first time me hearing about this type of situation. And it seems like here we are in Texas, not too far away from Tennessee, and this went down again. So in early June, a local black man, Lemuel Walters, was beaten by two white men for allegedly making romantic advances toward their sister, a white woman from Kilgore. Walters was arrested and put in the Gray County Jail, but a mob showed up at the jail on June 17th, and the sheriff gave Walters to the mob, who shot and killed him. Now, this sounds very familiar, like I said, with the Ed Johnson case in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That seemed to be another familiar method of operations that white folks took back in those times. They would go to a jail, and the sheriff, I'm sure the way it looked like, it seemed like the sheriffs were willing to allow white mobs, to go in and snatch these black people out of the jail cells and do whatever they wanted to do with them. There seemed to be a pattern with this thing here. All right. So the story was printed in the Chicago Defender on July 10th and enraged local whites who blamed the article on Jones, although he denied writing it. So now they got upset when this guy Jones from the Chicago Defender printed that article out. So white folks got upset about that. Later that day, Jones was attacked and beaten across the street from the Gregg County Courthouse by the same men who beat up Walters. Dr. Davis arrived in his vehicle and took Jones to his office to treat him. The two men appealed to Mayor Gabrielle A. Bodenheim for protection, but were instead advised to leave town. Jones hid with relatives, and they gathered 25 friends to protect his home. Around midnight, a group of white men arrived at Jones' house, but were met with gunfire. So again, we have a situation where black people stood up for themselves and didn't cower down, and as they should. All right. 3 other white men were injured, and another who hid under a nearby house was beaten badly by the black defenders of the home. So before I go on, that should be something to take note. You shouldn't feel like you're not supposed to protect yourself when you justifiably are supposed to. But nowadays, they'll make it seem like you're not even supposed to protect yourself if somebody tries to harm you. So this needs to be taught a lot more to black kids, like when they go to school and stuff like that, because the school system will allow kids to get their face smashed in and beat up and suspended if the child decides to protect themselves. That's kind of backwards, and I don't understand that, but that's the kind of the mindset of the school systems today when it comes to that type of issue, when kids are legitimately, protecting themselves, not starting any fights or anything like that. The school system still punishes those who do the right thing as when it comes to protecting themselves. So that mindset needs to change, man. Anyway, as the word spread, a crowd of almost 1,000 whites began to gather back in town, with some breaking into Welch's hardware store to take guns and ammunition. The crowd burned down Jones's home, Dr. Davis's home and office, and a black dance hall. Although Texas Governor William P. Hobby sent 8 Texas Rangers to Longview, the violence continued. On the night of July 12, Marion Bush, father-in-law of Dr. Davis, was killed by a local white farmer. On Sunday, July 13th, Governor Hobby declared martial law in all of Gregg County and ordered all residents of Longview to surrender their weapons at the county courthouse. An estimated 5,000 to 7,000 weapons were turned in, and more soldiers and rangers arrived in town to quell the riots. 17 white men were arrested for attempted murder on July 14, but all were released. 9 other white men were arrested for arson and then released. None of the men were prosecuted. 21 black men were arrested for assault and attempted murder and moved to an Austin, Texas jail for their safety. Eventually, all were released without trials to avoid any further unrest in Longview. Martial law ended on July 18th, and citizens were allowed to retrieve their firearms the next day. The Longview Race Riot was one of 25 riots that took place from May through October 1917 during what would be called the Red Summer. So that's interesting as well. I wonder if all those race riots, they said 25 of them took place. I wonder if they were all race related or race related in nature. Right. So there you have it, man. Like I said, it seems to have been a lot of what they call race riots that have been going on between blacks and whites. And it seems like during those times, a lot of black people stood up for themselves. But that's not the narrative that schools and the put in my fingers in air quotes, the system wants Black people to know about or to be involved with being able to protect themselves. But apparently back in those days, in those times, they were very much into making sure they protect themselves. They wasn't going for the game plan. All right. So that is the Longview Race Riot.